So we're going to talk about just a few general characteristics of birds, especially some of the unique adaptations they have as compared to other animals. And as we've been going along, we talked about reproduction, we talked about body temperature, the chambers of the heart, and so forth. And what you'll see is that birds are sort of the next step along in how they've adapted to do what they need to do. So bones. If you ever, when I was in college, I had to take a class in ornithology, studying birds. And we got to hold like a bird's skeleton. And they're much lighter than you would think. So when you pick up, if you were to hold, if there's a living bird here, and you could just pick it up, it would feel much lighter than you would otherwise think it actually is. Birds are fairly light for their size. You know, if you had a bird this size compared with a mammal this size, the mammal would be much heavier. Regardless, so an ostrich of this size would be much lighter than a mammal of the same size. And part of that is because of the bones. Bones have sort of very lightweight and hollowish bones. Now, they're not completely hollow, okay, but they're much less dense than other animals. Inside of the bones of birds, instead of having sort of a very solid, dense layer of bone material, it's mostly hollow with some bone reinforcement that makes it still strong but lightweight. So you can see all these little threads of bone that are crisscrossed inside of that give it strength without making it very heavy. Here's an actual picture. You can see sort of this web of bone tissue. And again, that gives it the strength, but because it's a lot of empty space, they're fairly lightweight. Reproduction. We're going to talk a lot about birds and eggs and so forth. What type of fertilization do birds have? Matthew? No? Try. Internal. They have internal fertilization. So male birds deposit sperm inside female birds. Those sperm cells fertilize an egg cell. And then what happens? If that egg is fertilized, what happens with it? Yeah, it develops, gets covered with a shell, and then the female bird releases those eggs. So they have internal fertilization, but what we call external development. The embryos grow outside of the body in an egg. And we'll talk a lot more about eggs in a minute, but for now we can just say that. How about body temperature for birds? Yeah? They're warm-blooded, yes. This is the first group of vertebrates that we're talking about that were warm-blooded. So who could remind me, what does that mean? Cameron?
Body temperature stays the same.
They maintain a constant body temperature internally, yes. So this is good in some ways. How is it good for the bird? How is it beneficial to be warm-blooded? Samantha?
Because if they're in like a cold environment, then they wouldn't get cold all of a sudden. They would just stay the same.
Yeah, is that they can live in a much wider range of temperatures than cold-blooded animals. So like right now, today it's whatever, 17 degrees out. But when you're taking the bus here, you probably saw some birds around, if you were paying attention. Okay? Probably see some crows and stuff in the trees. So even though it's 17 degrees out, they're still around, they're still active, they're flying around, they're looking for food. A cold-blooded creature couldn't do that. Its body temperature would be dropped way down, and it couldn't be active at this temperature. So they can live in a wide variety of climates. They can, live in very, very cold conditions. They can live in very hot conditions because they're maintaining their body temperature internally. So that's why it's beneficial. They can live in a wide variety of climates. But what's the downside to being warm-blooded? Sort of a trade-off. Because being warm-blooded means what? Sydney?
I had a question.
Oh, okay, hold on. Let me get this answer first. Cameron, do you have an answer?
You can overheat or freeze that.
Well, it could happen sometimes, but I'm thinking of something else. In order to maintain that body temperature, it takes a lot of energy. And so warm-blooded animals need to eat much more than a similar sized cold-blooded creature, because a lot of that energy is going just to keeping that body temperature the way it is. So they need more food. So they can live a wide variety of temperatures, but they require more energy. So what was your question?
So dinosaurs were cold-blooded?
Dinosaurs were cold-blooded, yeah. Circulation, so birds, so we talked about fish, 2 chambers in their heart. Amphibians, 3. Reptiles, 3.5. Birds have 4-chambered hearts. A 4-chambered heart is the most efficient type of heart to get the maximum amount of oxygen to all the cells of the body. In a 4-chambered heart, oxygenated blood, oxygen-rich blood is kept completely separate from the oxygen-poor blood. And so blood that's low in oxygen can get sent to the lungs to get recharged. Blood that's high in oxygen can get sent to all the parts of the body to deliver that oxygen. They're kept completely separate. And that's important. Birds require a lot of oxygen because they use a lot of energy in flight. And so, in order to use that energy, they need to get as much oxygen as possible to those cells of their body. And the chambers are the right atrium, the right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. 4 chambers, just like in the human heart, same thing. We have 4 chambers in our heart. We're going to spend a while on bird eggs, actually today and tomorrow, but just in general, a bird egg is different from a reptile egg. Again, it has this brittle, hard shell. It's made of calcium. And it's waterproof. But it does allow gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, to go through. So it's permeable to oxygen and carbon dioxide. And bird eggs need to be incubated after the female lays the egg. They need to be incubated, or that means kept at a certain temperature and humidity in order for them to grow and develop. So that's why you may know that a bird might, the female might sit on the eggs to keep them warm for a certain amount of time until they develop and can then eventually hatch. We have people that raise eggs for baby chicks. You can take fertilized chicken eggs and you can put them in an incubator that keeps them at the right temperature and moisture and allows them to grow, develop, and eventually hatch. Now the eggs you get at the grocery store, could those have been baby chicken?
No.
So the eggs you get at the grocery store are chicken eggs usually. You can buy duck eggs and other stuff, but most of the ones you buy in a dozen are chicken eggs. So they can, if you take one of those eggs and you put it in an incubator, would it grow into a baby chick?
No.
Why not? Garrett?
Because they did this, they gave the chickens like this shot so the eggs, when they laid the eggs, that they wouldn't become baby chickens.
No, not so much a shot, but you're sort of on the right track. They wouldn't become baby chickens, Sydney? They weren't fertilized. So the eggs you buy at the grocery store came from, you know, or you could buy them somewhere else. We get our eggs from a woman who has a little chicken coop at her house, and she raises chickens for eggs, and she sells them to people. And so we get our eggs from her. How does she make sure that the eggs we get don't have little baby chicks inside of them? What does she do?
Shake them.
No.
Oh my, what? Yo. It's not your ear. She
No.
takes the male away.
Ah, there you go. They keep the male chicken, a rooster, needs to be kept away from all the hens. If there's no rooster, no male chicken, then they can't be fertilized.
Wait, are roosters and chickens the same?
Roosters and chickens are the same animal. So chicken's the animal. A female chicken is a hen. A male chicken is a rooster. And so if they're kept separate, obviously the male rooster can't fertilize those eggs. And so even if they're not fertilized, the female continues to release eggs, even if they're not fertilized. So those eggs that we get from this woman, they never could have been baby chicks in them because they were never fertilized. If she wants to then get some eggs that she can hatch into chicks to get some more chickens in her house, then what would she do?
Fertilize it.
She'd allow the rooster to get together with the female chickens, with the hens. He would then fertilize some of those eggs, and those eggs that are released, those would be fertile eggs. And if they were then incubated, the embryo could grow and develop into an actual chicken. So that's how they make sure they're not. And they can. You ever heard of candling a chicken egg?
I don't know.
It's when this is sort of in older times. They would take eggs that chickens laid and they'd hold them up to a candle. And because of the bright light of the candle, they could actually see through the egg a little bit, and you could see if there's an embryo in there. Today they do the same thing. They could do it, but with a very bright light. And you can sort of see inside the egg and make sure there's no embryo there. But anyway, so once those eggs lay, if they are fertilized, they need to be incubated. Migration. So you guys, when we were talking just now, I said you probably saw some crows and stuff. Most birds, though, are not here around this time of the year. Where are they?
West, south.
South, could be west, but they're somewhere else. They've migrated. Why? Why are they migrating? So they're warm-blooded. They can live in a wide variety of temperatures, but they're not here right now. Why not? PJ? No, because they could live here at a cold temperature.
Because their food can't survive?
It's about food. So if you're a bird that eats insects, right now, this is not a good place for you to be. There's no insects around. If you eat worms and stuff, can't get them in the frozen ground. So it's not a good place to be because of the food. Not so much because of the cold, because of a lack of food. So many birds will migrate and move to another part of the earth where there is food available. Some birds don't migrate though. Like I say, you may see a bunch of crows around still. So what are they eating? They're here, they must be eating something. Samantha?
Like seeds or stuff from bird.
Sometimes, stuff from bird feeders. Where do you see lots of crows?
By garbage.
Garbage, roadkill. Crows will eat just about anything. They're very opportunistic. They'll eat basically anything that's available. And they can exist on just those little, the squirrel that got hit by a car, or garbage you put out and they got it in the bag and picked it apart. So they can live in they can exist on those sorts of things. But most birds migrate. How birds migrate is still a little bit of a mystery to scientists. Like when birds will return back to their homes in the summertime, how do they find it? And that's a question scientists have asked for a long time. Is it visual? Do they know by what they see? Is it magnetism? They can sense the Earth's magnetic fields. And it's sort of probably a combination of several factors. They've sometimes done experiments like homing pigeons where they put little contact lenses in their eyes to make them blind. And often they can still find their way back to their home. Or they put little magnets attached to them to throw off their sense of the Earth's magnetic field and see if they can still navigate. Some scientists, there's all sorts of ways they may do that. All right, bird feathers. So I have some feathers to show you. So this is probably from, I don't know what this is from. But bird feathers are adapted to allow the bird to do what?
Fly.
Fly. But this is a flight feather. Some feathers on the bird are used for flight. Feathers mainly on the wings. And this is a flight feather. It has this distinctive shape. It's actually made of, if you see this feather, you can actually, that's what I was doing earlier, you can separate the barbs. These are called barbs of the feather. They have tiny little hooks on them, and then they can reconnect. If you sort of smooth it out, they can reconnect. Because in order to fly, to provide lift, it needs to be a pretty solid surface there. And if you take this feather, if you sort of wave it back and forth, you can feel, because of the shape of the feather, when it moves over the air, it provides lift. And as you wave it back and forth, you can feel that lift. That's what allows the birds to fly. Also, if you have a pet bird. Anyone have a pet bird? We have like, I don't know, 2 or 3.
Hey, Fauci does, ask that question.
So, if you have a pet bird and you don't want it to like fly out of its cage or whatever, you can clip the wings, which is not clipping the actual wings, but clipping the feathers. If you cut the ends of the feathers off, then they lose their ability to provide lift, and it's just harder for the bird to fly. And they'll sort of flap their wings, but they grow back eventually, so you're not really permanently damaging the bird.
Did you clip
No,
your?
no, it's like cutting your hair.
Did you?
I don't. I think my wife has done it before. I don't take care of the birds.
You're mean. Yeah.
They're not my birds.
Birds
They're
are.
kind of annoying. They're always. Cindy? Yeah, they sort of like flap their wings and kind of go halfway and then fall back.
That's so
Sorry.
sad. Where do you keep your birds?
I don't keep mine. They're not my birds.
Yes, they are. Where does your family keep
They
their
have a
birds?
cage where they make a mess and spray their bird seed all over the place, and their feathers are everywhere and they're loud.
Do they wake you up?
Yeah, sometimes.
What about you?
All right. So anyway, this is a flight feather from the wing, and I'll pass this around. You could check it out.
Wait, Mr.
But there are other types of feathers as well. These are down feathers.
Oh, like the geese.
These, I don't know, all birds have down feathers. But why have you heard of geese down feathers, goose down feathers?
They're in like coats and stuff.
They're in coats, they're in pillows and blankets. If you look at those, I'll pass these around to you in a second, but these are much different looking feathers than this. They're sort of wispy and they're not all connected, they're less dense. And what down feathers do is, you can take it out of there if you want, is they trap air close to the bird's body and provide insulation. And that allows them to maintain their body heat. And so they're in a pillow, or they could be in a jacket, or they could be in a blanket or a sleeping bag, and they keep you warm. And sometimes if you have like a down pillow, a feather sometimes comes poking out. You can like pull it out, and there's you'll see a tiny little feather that looks like that. Those are real goose down feathers. Also, they provide camouflage, and they provide a way to attract mates because of the coloring. Often male birds are very brightly colored and showy versus females, which often are more camouflage.
Are those the feathers that you could like use for ink? That
Can you
one?
touch these?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a pointy surface. Yeah, you can touch
Oh
it.
man, I'm way behind.
On a coat.
Flying. On a cold.
Did you see that?
Did she just say
Oh.
something cold? What is it?
So there's different types of feathers that provide these different functions. All right. Now, birds evolved from what? I don't know. Where did birds? Julia?
Dinosaurs?
Yeah, reptiles, dinosaurs. Scientists know this by looking at the fossil record. And one of the most famous fossils ever was this fossil that was called Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx was an animal that was fossilized in very, very fine sediment. So scientists could see a lot of detail about this animal. And what they found, the name itself means ancient bird. It's about the size of a crow. And it was preserved in rock, and scientists found it. And it's an intermediate fossil. It shows a transition between a reptile and a bird. It had some characteristics that were bird-like, and other characteristics that were reptile-like.
So was it considered a bird or
Neither. This is an actual picture of it. It was preserved like this. And so what you see is these are the feathers, and it was preserved so well they could see the tiny little detail of the feathers. So it had feathers, but at the end of its wings, it actually had claws at the end of its wings still. So obviously birds today don't have that. Reptiles do have four claws, so that's one thing. It also had a tail, but was made of bone, like an extension of the vertebrae, so it had a bony tail, like a lizard would. But today, modern birds don't have that bony tail. They just have a tail made of feathers. It had scales covering much of its body. This is what scientists, it had teeth. This is what scientists think it may have looked like when it was alive. So again, you have scales covering all the neck and the head. You have teeth, you have claws up here at the ends of the wings. So it's sort of a bony tail, a combination of traits between birds and reptiles. All right, the last two slides today we're gonna start to talk about eggs. And we're gonna start by talking about an unfertilized egg. An egg that you could have eaten for breakfast this morning. It has some parts, and all of those parts have a certain function that the bird is useful for the bird as it's growing and developing. So, most of these parts you probably know, and you've probably seen some of these before. So the outer layer, obviously, is what?
The membrane.
No?
Shell.
Shell. The shell of the egg is the outermost layer. Now, I'm not going to talk much right now about the what they do. That's our next two slides. But the outer layer is the shell. Then, inside of that, Matthew,
Membrane.
is the shell membrane.
Oh, you shell.
You probably, if you crack an egg and you look inside the shell, you can see the thin membrane there. If you make a hard-boiled egg and you're trying to peel it, sometimes that membrane gets stuck to the egg and you have to kind of peel it off. That's the shell membrane. When we did our vinegar and egg thing, we got rid of the shell, but the thing I was holding on to was that membrane, that shell membrane.
Spinning thingies.
Oh,
Good
that's.
job.
It was like spinning.
We're going to get there. All right, then we have the egg yolk, obviously, which is, the yellow part in the middle of the egg. And then surrounding the yolk is the clear part. You might call it egg white when it's cooked. It's called albumin is the scientific name for the clear part, the egg white. Now, attached, if you ever crack an egg into like a dish, if you're like baking or something, you may see attached to the yolk a couple sort of white, sort of stringy things.
Yeah.
Those are like make me throw up.
Those are called chalazi. And they actually hold the yolk in place. They're like protein ropes that suspend the yolk in the middle of the egg. That's their purpose. I added this one too at a time. Then you have the yolk membrane. The yolk membrane is a very, very thin layer that keeps the yolk together. If you're like making eggs sunny side up and you want the yolk to stay in the middle, you try not to rupture the yolk membrane. But then you dunk your toast in it and you rupture that membrane and then the egg yolk oozes out.
So is the albumin like cytoplasm?
Not quite, because this isn't one cell.
Yeah.
So, no, it's just protein and water basically.
Yeah, those things are gross.
All right, then we have, if you ever, so an egg is not like a perfect oval. One end is wider than the other. And the wide end is something called the air space.
Oh.
Or if you look, when you crack the egg, if you look in the larger end, there's like a little bubble there. It's filled with air. That's the air space. Or if you get a hard-boiled egg, one end has an indentation.
Why?
That's because of the air space.
What, like, why?
There's air in there, and so there's a little
Yeah.
gap.
I didn't know why they have.
We're going to talk about it in a second. And finally, you may not have ever noticed it, but if you crack an egg and you look at it in the dish, on the yolk there will be a little patch of white on there. Very small,
Yeah.
like a pencil point. That's called the blastoderm. Sometimes it's also called the germinal disc. We'll talk about that in a second.
We can just call it the
I like that name better.
All right. So let's talk in our last two slides about what all these parts do. Now the shell of the egg, it's made of calcium. And actually, if there's an embryo in there growing and developing, that shell starts to dissolve and break down. And some of the calcium from that shell is actually used to make the bird's bones. So it provides calcium to form the bones of the chicken. Also, as it gets thinner, as it dissolves, it makes it easier for the chick to break out of that egg.
Wait, if it's unfertilized, then why would it be used to?
We're saying all of these parts have a function if it were fertilized.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Gotcha.
That shell membrane, that thin layer, that's to prevent bacteria from getting into the egg.
Interesting. Every day I learn something new.
The air space, that little gap there, it provides two things. First, it's like a shock absorber. So if the egg gets rolled around, it kind of cushions it. But also, when the chick is getting ready to hatch, it pokes its beak into that gap, into that air space, and that's where it takes its first breath from. That little air. What about the yolk? What's the yolk for? Some people out think that's a chick. It's a baby chick.
No,
that
it's
you're
what they
eating.
eat.
Yeah, it's not. What is it, Matthew?
It's what like the chick eats when it's still in the egg.
Yeah, I don't know if I would exactly say it eats it. It's not like it's like eating it with its beak. It's connected into the inside of the chick through vessels, but it provides energy, nutrients, minerals for the chick embryo as it grows. It doesn't eat anything that's in there, but it does
Could there be
need energy.
Isn't that
two
like?
chicks in one egg?
Not usually.
Two chicks in one egg.
It has sort of like.
Is that ever happened?
The yolk membrane
Wait,
what was the yolk?
keeps the yolk together, minerals.
Where is it?
The yolk membrane keeps all the yolk in one place. Those protein rope things, those chalazae, keep the yolk suspended. They keep it in the middle of the egg so it doesn't sort of sink to the bottom or the top.
Suspense.
The albumin,
The yolk.
the clear part in a raw egg or the egg white,
Oopsies.
that provides protein and water that will eventually the chick embryo will absorb to use to grow.
The spine. The yolk.
And then the blastoderm, that little patch of white cells, is actually, in there is the cell that could have been fertilized and could have grown into the baby chick. Okay? So that's where sperm would enter into that blastoderm, combine with it, and then it would start to divide, and it would start to grow into a tiny little chicken embryo.
Sperm.
If the sperm doesn't enter there, if it's not fertilized, then it just stays a little tiny patch of cells. Valid?
Why is it only half of a feather?
It's not, you can see, there's still some, you can see the feathers here, but it provides a stiff edge that just allows air to
Oh.
glide over.
Is that a feather right up there? Is that a pig?
Where?
Up there. Is that a feather?
Where is up where?
Oh, right. Down. I see it. Right. Up. You're really
Oh,
good.
that?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that is, I think.
Wait,
What is
is
this?
this only up there?
It's a peacock feather.
I always thought that was a shadow.